Hi everyone, Happy New Year. This is the Grand Duke Dmitri Diary Series, and here as I'm doing this, it's the 1st of January 2024. I don't want to take us back a century. And I skipped New Year's Eve. I was due to do one on New Year's Eve, but things got busy, so I did not. So apologies for that. But today we are still working on the long diary entry for the 15th of March. And in fact, Dmitri has run out of space in his previous diary volume, so he's had to get another diary. And so he makes a note of that. He starts his new diary with the sign of the cross, and then he says, continuation of my notes, which is what he calls his diary entries, for 15th March 1921. And he specifies that it's book 26. All of his diary volumes are numbered, and he wrote so much more than what you typically have room for in a diary. It's supposed to last a year, right? But his diary volumes usually last between 2 and 3 months. So let's see, we need a recap from last time. He was talking about news from Russia of rebellions going on against the Soviet government. I think I mentioned last time that actually I hadn't looked it up, and I wasn't sure if Russia had already taken the name the Soviet Union, but actually it hadn't. I think at this time it was called the Soviet Republic, maybe, but it wouldn't officially become the Soviet Union until 2022. And Dmitri is calling it the Soviet state. So so he's getting information about these rebellions, first from his friend Prince Olga while he was still in Denmark, and then when he stopped in Berlin, he was hearing it from people and reading about it in the newspaper and not knowing quite what to think. And he mentions that there were uprisings in both capitals, but that they seem to be over, and he'll talk about that again, and that the real center of things now is Kronstadt, the fortified island and naval base in the Gulf of Finland. So we do not have a cast of thousands this time. We have one person, and not a person who Dmitri ever met in person, but an important person for what he's writing about, and that was Major General Alexander Nikolaevich Kozlovsky, a man who was in his 50s at the time and was involved in the Kronstadt rebellion. So, okay, let's dive in. I will just say that he begins by saying, in that book. And when he says in that book, he means the diary volume that he has just filled up, so that now he's starting this new one. And he's writing this in Paris. Okay, sounds like my dog is chewing on something. Okay, in that book, I had only begun to write about the revolution in the Soviet state and about the actual departure of Kronstadt from the Soviet government. I also talked about the fact that apparently the uprisings in Petrograd and Moscow have been completely suppressed. But if one believes the newspapers, things haven't been going well for the Bolsheviks, because rebellions are occurring in other places, such as Oryol, Kursk, Kharkov, and Pskov provinces. And all these rebellions apparently are movements of the people against the communists. But for the moment, all eyes are on Kronstadt. Apparently that is considered a more serious matter, because the isolated position of the fortress and the presence of military supplies, of course, mean that the rebel sailors and workers are much more able to resist the Red Army. It is not yet entirely clear who exactly is leading the movement and under what banner. They speak of a certain Kozlovsky, but no one knows precisely who and what he is. Some say he's a general staff officer, others that it's simply a revolutionary pseudonym. As for the causes that the rebels are championing, oh God, it's always something. As for the causes that the rebels are championing, they make quite a bad impression on me. It's unclear what the sailors want. Either a socialist revolutionary program or a continuation of the Soviet regime, but without Jews and with national Soviets. Apparently, this anti-Semitic movement is growing at a frightening rate. They even say that when the uprising had only just begun in Petrograd, the workers were marching with signs that read, "Down with Jews, long live the Soviets." Beyond that, in the provinces, there seems to be a general massacre of Jews who are fleeing in masses to Poland. Okay, so he is very right when he says this is a frightening phenomenon. And these signs used, of course, not the word Jews, but a racial slur. And when we're talking about Soviets, there's Soviet with a capital S, the main Soviet, the Soviet. A Soviet is council. And when the revolution first started, there were Soviets, many different Soviets. There were the Soviet of Workers and Soldiers Deputies. There were Soviets in every town and locality. And now we have just one Soviet. We have the ruling power, the government. And so when people say who are rebelling against the Bolshevik, the Soviet government, hold signs that say "Long live the Soviets," then that means they want a return to these small or decentralized units of governance. So these diary entries, or these sections of this long diary entry, are much more historical in orientation than the ones that he does just about his personal life, of course, talking about very important events. And it's wonderful to have his view of it and the emigre view of it. I don't know about the provinces that he mentions, Oryol, Kursk, Kharkov, and Pskov. I don't know about rebellions there, and not because there weren't rebellions in those places, but because I just haven't looked into that. I have heard about one that was definitely going on for quite a while in Tambov, but anyway, I can confirm from what I have read that there were peasants' uprisings as well as workers' uprisings. And in fact, Dmitri is right when he said that these are movements of the people. They're not, they're not intellectuals or professional revolutionaries. They are peasants and workers. They're ordinary people. And he's right when he says that Kronstadt was really ideally situated to put up resistance, at least holding out longer than the rebellions on land, since Kronstadt was so difficult to reach and so heavily fortified. So in general, the information that he's getting at this point seems to be pretty good. So he's right, unfortunately, about the anti-Semitism that was expressed by the Kronstadt rebels. And as he also says, in the other rebellions and in the Kronstadt rebellion, there was this frightening anti-Semitism. And he's right that Jews were being massacred. There were pogroms throughout the country, and so Jews were trying to get to Poland or to the Baltic states, get out of the country, save their lives. And one thing that I'm surprised that he has so little information about is Kozlovsky himself. Because Kozlovsky, he shouldn't really be such an obscure figure. He was an artillery officer, and an important one. And I guess he'd spent many years before the outbreak of the First World War, and part of the war years he'd spent in Siberia as an artillery officer in Siberia. And so maybe that's why people in military circles that Dmitri had contact with and that he himself had come from weren't really aware of this guy, although he wasn't just he wasn't just some low-level officer. He had been the commander of an artillery brigade in Siberia, and then he'd become the inspector of artillery for the 34th Artillery Corps. That was during the First World War. During the Civil War, apparently he was fighting on the side of the Reds, so he was the chief of artillery on the Southern Front. And in December 1920, so a few months before the Kronstadt Rebellion began in March 1921, he was appointed the chief of artillery for the fortress. So he wasn't a naval man, he was in the army, but in addition to being a naval base, Kronstadt had this fortress, and it was very heavily fortified, lots of artillery, and so he was in charge of that. And, I don't know if you would call him the leader or not, but he was on board with this rebellion, and he was part of it. And he survived it. Spoiler alert, I'll go a little in advance of where we are with Dmitri and say that Kozlovsky was one of the men who was able to cross the ice on the Gulf of Finland and actually walk out of the fortress and walk to Finland and receive refugee status there. So he was able to do that, and he died there in 1940 as a free man. But the things were not at all as good for his family. Unfortunately, his family were persecuted after he escaped, and very sad story. They all ended up in gulags. I think maybe his daughter was the only one who survived, but they all had a miserable existence for many, many years. And, should Kozlovsky have surrendered in the hope that his family would be spared? Yeah, maybe, but on the other hand, I don't think his family would have been spared. He would have been killed, and I don't think his family would have been spared. I think they still would have been sent to the gulags. So, and his daughter did eventually get out. She was snuck out. You don't say sneaked, do you? But she was secretly gotten out of Russia and rejoined her father in Finland. But the top-ranking Bolsheviks, several of them, who were involved with this putting down of the Kronstadt Rebellion, killing the rebels, persecuting their families. These men, they had their day of reckoning. Many of them were killed in the Stalinist purges. And Trotsky, who was one of those who was advocating for the harshest possible measures in relation to Kronstadt, also, of course, was murdered. But probably the majority of them died in the Stalinist purges. So, if they'd been smart, they would have walked across the ice to Finland too. So what I have here is I have a list of the 14 demands that the rebels in Kronstadt made. And, they're mostly demands that we could identify with. For instance, number 2 was freedom of speech and the press. Number 3 was freedom of assembly. And, they wanted everybody to have equal rations instead of the members of the party getting more than everybody else. They wanted the peasants to be in control of their own land and their own farming. They wanted small businesses to be allowed. The problem with that is that, they wanted it only for certain groups of people. So they wanted a freedom of assembly for labor unions and peasant institutions. They wanted freedom of speech for workers. They didn't want them for everybody. So that was a little bit of a problem. And then obviously also the anti-Semitism. Yeah, so it wasn't, in some ways it wasn't great. But Dmitri will have a lot to say about that in the next section of this diary entry, about what he thinks about them and what they want. And, you know, he's already said that he's not happy with the anti-Semitism, but there are other things as well that he's going to talk about that are things that are problematic, things that make him very pessimistic about where this is all going to lead, what the other emigres think about it, what not just emigres, but people in other parts of Europe think about it. He's got a lot to say about it, so I hope you'll come back for that. And as he's writing this, it's obviously still ongoing. So, yeah, come back, and I will see you next time. Bye.